Washia, hello. Thank you everyone for being with us today for the first in a series of 5 webinars on protected areas. My name is Krista Lozier. I'm a Conservation Project Officer at the First Nations of Quebec and Labrador Sustainable Development Institute, FNQL-SDI. I would like to take a moment so that we can have a thought of gratitude for the territory in which we find ourselves. Thank you. I will let my colleague Pascal present herself as well.
Hello everyone. Thanks everyone for being here. Such large numbers on the first webinar on protected areas. I'm happy to be here with you. My name is Pascal Ayat, and I'm also the project manager in conservation at the FNQL-SDI. So I would like to take time to welcome you to your respective traditional territories. So the next 5 webinars will be on the conservation and natural protection component. So this will be the intervention of First Nations for the conservation of biodiversity. We are aware that the David Suzuki Foundation was ready to organize, get involved with us to organize these 5 webinars. So to continue, allow an account from Snap and colleague, but I'd like to mention Charles Magnan from the FNQL-SDI. He allowed us, he is providing us with technical support, so I'll leave the floor to Véronique. Kuwait, Lisa Mullen, that's very, I'm working with the David Suzuki Foundation. It's been for 2 years now. I'm in charge of the Boreal campaign. But the scope is greater because my goal is to be able to integrate this into the foundation with Native organizations, to have the Native to Indigenous knowledge to be considered and respected as much as Western knowledge. So we'll have the observations of several nations that are considered to this work and this recognition of our knowledge. We know that we appreciate this relationship to the resources, and we talk about protected areas. It's very important for me because it's the recognition of the unceded territories in Quebec, and through this, the principle of reconciliation, that we're stuck together, we can say. How can we keep working together and to stop colonization? So through the David Suzuki Foundation, I have access to be able to exchange and bring the voice of the communities together as far as possible, and to work with people who I respect a great deal. So I'm very happy to collaborate with the FNQL-SDI, with SNAP Quebec, is to ensure that this process to discover for the protected areas and Indigenous lands as territories as well, on land and water, and to work with these communities and help them establish models. So that's why I'm here. And recently, you see how important it is to hear voices from the Indigenous communities. So thank you for the FNQL-SDI. So I'm very happy to be part of this webinar series. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Melissa. I will introduce you to the agenda for today. So there's going to be 3 blocks, presentation blocks. After each of the presentation blocks, there will be a question period. After the first block, we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and have 2 last blocks, and then will be a discussion period. So the first block will be on protected areas in Quebec, definition, status, and creation. The second block will be the legal framework of protected areas in Quebec, governance and management. And part 3 will address the subject of protected areas and First Nations. So now I'll leave the floor to Véronique.
C'est sûr qu'à l'origine, on avait prévu faire.
We want to do this meeting in person. We had to adjust, and now we have to hold it virtually It's too bad because we won't have the quality of exchanges that we could have had in person, but this will allow us to see each other over several weeks. I hope there'll be many of you to accompany for a series of webinars. We'll be able to build on what we did today and continue our reflections over the next weeks. So today, the webinar deals with the protected areas in Quebec for the federal and provincial statuses as well, both of them, because that's both have to be involved to create protected areas in Quebec. As Christelle said, they will be divided into three parts. Part one, protected areas in Quebec, definitions, categories, and creation. Then we'll talk about jurisdictional framework for protected areas in Quebec, governance and management, part three, but we'll be able to continue this in the discussion. It's for protected areas and First Nations for your specific context as First Nations. So to begin, I'm very confident that today I will present more conventional approaches to protected areas. And it's not always perfectly aligned with certain visions of Indigenous world. It's just quite diverse, and I'm aware of this. I know that quite often for Indigenous peoples, the landscape is seen as a continuum. In a more Western approach, we tend to approach this between land and water, let's say, or between different ecosystems. I'm also aware of the fact that the respect towards nature involves hunting, trapping, fishing. These activities were often excluded in conservation tools today. Fortunately, that all of this has changed, and there are a lot of statuses of protected areas that allow us to continue to practice traditional activities, or to allow the Indigenous peoples to do so. Since we want to hold these webinars and we didn't want to keep you there all day, we don't want to put you to sleep, we wanted to break this down. So to separate this, we're going to talk about tools on land, and next week we'll talk about the water courses, watersheds. So there are different ways of doing things, but for logistical reasons. And also, seeing as these are different tools, we chose to prepare this. And in a few weeks, there will be a webinar, which will be dealing with Indigenous protected areas and Indigenous areas. I am aware that what I present this morning, this information won't be perfect. It won't meet all your needs. It's not aligned, or it's in keeping with all of your ways of working. But as I said before, I've been working in this field for 20 years. And today we're in a moment where there are many opportunities. There are many possibilities that open up to us and to you. Now, do an overview. Some of you are more familiar with the term protected area. What is a protected area? According to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, a protected area is, well, this is a non-governmental organization, the IUCN, which is recognized by all states as the main authority for protected areas and in the conservation of nature. And these are the definitions that most of these states, upon which the states will develop their own solutions. And Quebec is developing according to this definition. It is a clearly defined geographical space. So it's like drawing a line on a map, which is recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So there's a part of the territory that we put aside. Everyone agrees say that within the limits that we have defined, the priority will be the conservation of nature. Why are we talking about protected? While we're talking about protected areas, I wanted to mention that protected areas are known as a main tool internationally for the conservation of nature and biodiversity. There are several thousands of them throughout the world, and they're more and more. They're growing in number. So this is a tool that is shown that is proven to be efficient in the conservation of nature. Why is set up a protected area? First of all, is to protect territories and nature from industrial and other detrimental activities forever. That's important. And we say in the long term, but the idea is this for a long time. It's not just for 1 or 2 years or a few months. It's set up for always, forever. Let's see, is there some recognition? It allows forward monitoring of ecosystem health. and animal populations. It allows us to resolve specific conservation issues, including protection of endangered species. It's the habitat of an endangered animal. We have to meet these issues. And also for certain protected area categories, it allows us to value the territory and offer sustainable economic development opportunities, both inside and around the protected area. So that's not the case for all of the protected areas. So nonetheless, there are many benefits in setting up a protected area. The IUCN has a system of categories, different categories and management objectives. I present them here because these categories are used by the PAs, protected areas in provinces and by countries and provinces like Quebec to set up their own protected areas. So Quebec, for each of these protected area statuses, or even in Canada, will be attributing one of these categories. And these categories and the criteria that come with them are used to report on the progress made by states for the conservation of the territory. As you saw, there are different categories. Category 1 is divided into A and B. Category 1 is strict nature reserve. It's a place where we don't really go there. It's kept there for educational and scientific purposes, perhaps. A second one, O1B, same thing, wilderness area. 2, national park, but it could be something else in Quebec. We see this, a biodiversity reserve can be in category 2. So it's the protection of ecosystems and for protection and recreation. Category 3, natural monument or feature. So it's a particular element that we want to protect. It could be a specific forest or a wetland or a bog. For habitat species management area, like wildlife habitats. I mentioned that sometimes we want to target a certain species to protect, and that's the report, but generally for protected areas, which is used widely. And then the next is protected landscape, seascape, human activities, intervention, and ecosystems that created that the qualities of the ecosystem is done in Europe. They have a higher population density, so there are less uninhabited natural areas. We don't have this in Quebec yet. And 6, protected area with sustainable use of natural resources. As I mentioned before, in the past, we had a silo approach. Well, this is like almost like keeping it under a glass bell. It's in keeping with the mission of the protected areas. We're thinking of the Amazon, where there was rubber harvesting or the collection of non-ligneous forest matters, so the harvesting of nuts or other forest products, but this allows us to keep a forest healthy and intact. So you can protect it but use it by using it in a sustainable way. I'm talking about the IUCN. It is a reference, and in SNAP Quebec, observe, analyze what the government for a protected area will refer to the terms and guidelines say it's recognized in the scientific community. There are many indigenous communities that trap as well. So it is recognized as a category. So for protected areas should not be used as an excuse for expelling people from their traditional lands, or not envisioned like they did in the past, where we set up a protected area and we kick the people off the land. And the other nations denounce this, and with reason. And we have to use the categories to argue for environmentally insensitive development in protected areas, to argue for environmentally sensitive or sustainable activities in these places. So 4 types recognized by IUCN, 4 types of governance is governance by government, shared governance or co-governance, private governance, and governance by Indigenous peoples and local communities. I don't have the stats for Quebec, but we see the situation in Canada. It's in green, is governance by the government. So in the large majority of cases in Montreal, in Canada and Quebec, these protected areas are administered by the government. There's a small part that is shared governance. Private, this is quite minimal. and the indigenous peoples. It's might have changed a bit. This is data from a couple of years ago. We know that in Western Canada, indigenous protected areas have been created, but this hasn't really changed that much as these are the figures. So mainly it is the government that administers these protected areas. And here is a profile or a portrait of protected areas in Quebec. There were announcements made a few days about Anticosti Island, which changed the figures a little bit. I think we're at 10.08%. But this gives us provide you with a certain scale. So Quebec, you're probably aware that Quebec agreed as the signatory for the agreement on biological biodiversity to meet these objectives by 2020. So they have committed to protecting 10%, 7% of the land and 10% of the marine, the water territory, aquatic territory. So it's about 10%. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. It's 10.04% right now. It's if we look at terrestrial and freshwater protection, they're counted together. Lakes and rivers, it's in this category, so it's about 10.7% with the new announcements for Anticosti. In marine protected areas, we're at 1.3%, but there are some announcements made a few weeks ago, which will allow us to reach 10%, but this we'll keep this announcement for next week. There's something quite particular for the Plan Nord territory. We have a nice map. The objective was 20% to be protected by the end of the year, and currently we are at 11.8%. So in total, there are 4,892 natural sites. There might be a little bit more now since we compiled these figures, but a little bit less than 5,000 natural sites that meet protected area definition in Quebec. So we say that this is protected areas used. This model is used. Some are quite small, but nonetheless, it's an effective model. And we have to ensure that there are targets where Quebec is committed to. There are new targets after 2020 that were set by government Canada, and 20% by 2020 and 30% by 2030. So this they're calling to increase the amount of protected areas in the coming years. I'm going to speak very briefly because there's a webinar on the designation processes. I just wanted to mention it for you to have an idea. I'm going to go into more detail about this in a few weeks. Now, there is a much broader framework that influences the creation of protected areas. First of all, the types of areas or the targets that I mentioned. So there's a bit of pressure on the government to meet these targets. 17% by the end of 2020, 20% for the Plan Nord territory. There's something we call a reference ecological framework. So the territory will be divided into natural regions according to the characteristics of the ecosystem, and we have to ensure that we have representation, because beyond meeting a certain percentages, there's the notion that we must protect a bit of each ecosystem in the province. So the ecological reference map will allow us to make choices on where we will keep the protected areas to ensure that we has been contributed throughout the territory, not just in the north where there is less human activity. And we can think that it'll be easier to set up a protected area. We want to ensure that they also exist in southern Quebec, where the large majority of the population lives. And finally, the third element for the setting up of these protected areas, it is existing protected area categories, the possible conservation objectives and creation processes, which are often defined in the laws or the bills that govern protected areas. Now I'll present this. These are the general steps of creation. To give you an idea, apparently there's the identification of a site of interest. Could be done by local actors, by indigenous community or the government, and we have the gathering of information on the site of interest from local actors and through studies and analyses conducted by the government. Characterization analysis done by the government, and then we set up a master plan or a blueprint. A plan will have a temporary protection status as well to allow for a freeze of detrimental activities while waiting for public consultations. right now. Normally it's the BAP, which is the organization involved in these. Right now, there is a revision process as well, which is legislative for. This is on the use of natural heritage as well. It is under study at a parliamentary commission at the National Assembly. So through this presentation, I'll be mentioning changes that will be coming with this PL 46. It's a Bill 46. But the BAP process will be removed. There will be other public consultation processes, but it will no longer done through the BAP or the Bureau de l'Audience Publique, because it was very long and costly, and it added very long delays as well for the setting up of these areas. And many protected areas are in a projected status for many years because they were never able to get beyond the BAP process. So the consultation, we grant a permanent status, and then we get to the management phase. So this is an idea of how things work for the creation of a protected area. This is often done over many years with proposals. I'm sure that some of you, if you have projects to create protected areas and that you've been working on for a long time, it can take even a decade. So often the process is very long and drawn out. Fortunately, this allows us to have enough consultations. There you go. This concludes the first part. So we've got time for some questions. From the FNQL SDI, colleague and Pascal, I have a question about public consultation by the BAP. I'd like to know why the process is so long before being completed, as Veronique mentioned. Sometimes they're looking for more public opinion. Is that why it's so long? Well, it's quite expensive to set up a BAP process. The situation is that there are many biodiversity reserves that were set up around the 2000s, 2007, 2008, 2009. And at that time, the Quebec government was, they projected these statuses. They ended up with a whole bunch of, a pile of these projects that are blocked at this stage. But the protected area, the line is there, they didn't recognize it, but there is a temporary plan there. So in the meantime, not much has changed except that there can't be industrial development. But there are so many projects stuck at this stage that it would be impossible for the government to hold all these BAP hearings. It'll be impossible. I think that's probably why they are redrafting this bill, this law, and that's why eventually they will just be removing this mechanism. I'll talk about this, but another reason why the time frames are so long, because there has to be a consensus, inter-ministerial consensus for the Ministry of the Environment. They present a strategy, well, the Ministry of Parks and Natural Resources as well, different ministries, they often have diverging interests. So this could also be a reason why this is blocked and delayed. And also, obviously, all of the local actors have to meet to arrive at a consensus. So a lot of people agreed to say that, yes, these BAPs were too long. And these are some of the reasons. This is answer your question. Thank you very much. Beginning of your presentation, you said there were a lot of natives. You see the landscape as a continuum. The government tends to separate land and water with years of experience. Do you have any solutions or any reflections so that we could end up speaking the same language to improve communications or our understanding? I don't think this says situation is really improved. I've worked in James Bay for a long time, where we're in a very complex jurisdictional context, because we don't even know where the limit is. It governs the land and the water, but these issues have not been settled. In Quebec, it could be particularly complicated because federal government and the province don't always agree on where the limit is. And when we move ahead with a provincial or a federal tool in deciding which side is to act in a given situation, I think there are discussions. I think people are willing, from both the government, these people are willing to advance these governments. I think there are a lot of people who have good faith and we can find solutions. But at the same time, we end up butting up against these legal questions as well and not being able to advance and these situations. And hopefully through communicating, this can solve some of these issues. Like in Western Canada, we talked about they had mountaintop to sea bottom protection in a certain area in BC with agreements. That's one example. We could perhaps do something here and similarly. But yeah, we've got a long way to go. A question in the chat.
With the Bill 46 nearing its completion, in the bill itself, it does not clearly state the creation of IPCAs. Do we foresee this being a program when Indigenous communities try to create their own? It does mention OECM, so other conservation measures, which an IPC can fall under, but does not clearly state IPCAs.
So right now, in the version of Bill 46 that was tabled, there's no mention of indigenous protected areas. So this mentions the other conservation measures, but not indigenous protected areas. In fact, the category of indigenous protected areas was not included in Bill 46. However, I'd say that many proposals have been submitted to include a new category of indigenous protected areas. And SNAP Quebec, we also submitted a position paper where we clearly indicated this. I know other partners of ours have done this, the FNQL SDI as well, I believe. So it's not in the version of the bill right now, but we know that the Commission is looking into this. At the other measures, efficient conservation measures. Well, people have been trying to see how this can be used. I will also see which are the other measures as well. I'll just make a side comment. These are not places are not protected areas, so the vocation is not the conservation of biodiversity. But nonetheless, they have certain benefits. One example, there's some places like military bases. There's some military areas which are not really used sometimes. They could be decommissioned, there could be explosives or there devices, but the idea is not to protect biodiversity, but still they leave this place aside. So there is these factors as well. So for a lot of people, the goal is not necessarily to have the protection of biodiversity. We have protection of a mode of life and the cultural importance of this place. It's not based on biodiversity. It's just a mechanism to recognize places that are important for Indigenous peoples. But I'd say the question has not been settled yet. Maybe in a few weeks, when we did the webinar on Indigenous protected Indigenous areas, protected areas. I don't know if it will be there officially, but I know there are discussions about this. And there are many people who have expressed their wish to see this category created, the category of Indigenous protected areas in Bill 46. Does this answer your question? So thank you, Veronique. I just wanted to lead with this because a native Indigenous protected area, it's not the only terminology we can hear in English. We can hear tribal park English, which we can't really say that in Quebec, a parc tribal, not really. So it depends on nations as well to see how they want to name this area. It's something that is innovated by a lot of people in the government who are working in the on the bill, and there was a call to table these things. Good thing that SNAP was there because the foundation CEOs were caught up in the pandemics, and there's less. We weren't able to react with less members working on our team. But we could have to have management, and the communities can put a post-it there to recognize that in other protected areas, this includes an aspect that favors an Indigenous approach. Because if not, we'll continue with situations like Laveranderie Park. We don't know how to move forward, but each Indigenous protected area, we know that each community territory are different. So a lot of mystery around this, and sometimes they're a bit afraid of it. But there could be a request. We have to make a request to the government to ensure there's an opening. They can make this approach, and also in the spirit of the reconciliation. And it's really important to have this category of Indigenous protected area. For the time being, it is a working term because now we're just starting to discover what it is in Quebec, whereas in Western Canada, they've been doing these projects for a longer time. Don't have to say that sometimes the term is not there, but the idea that the community gets involved and they have to have their approval for the acceptance of this area. And with ancestral rights, which are recognized by the federal government and the Supreme Court, it won't be the only time they'll hear about this. I promise you that. Thank you, Melissa. I heard that Dolores had her hand up, seeing as currently Bill 46 is under consultation. There's no category of a protected area. We can mention these 5 categories. They are in the process. That in a few minutes, when we address the second part, I can mention the statuses that exist in Quebec. I was going to ask to see if we're in a process to recommend protected areas, like in our case. I want to know in which category we should include this. So in a few minutes, I will present the tools that are available in Quebec.
Je voudrais juste quand même profiter de cette occasion.
I just want to take this opportunity to mention, seeing that the change on protected areas is in a process of change, seeing as the consultation targeted with groups, and we in our organization we had this process and we submitted one summary of our position paper, which was done very quickly because they gave us they told us on Friday that we had to hand in the document the following Tuesday. So this is really unacceptable to see. It's very disrespectful on the government's part to demand this in such a short time frame. And that's what we mentioned. I don't know what they did at this level for the FNQL SDI that represents the Indigenous peoples of Quebec, but it should be good to denounce this. And they said those that will submit a position paper, they can submit it for 30 days after the consultation. I mentioned this. It would be good that several communities submit the recommendation to have an Indigenous protected area. I think there will be strength in numbers if we all get together to promote this in Quebec. Several Indigenous communities can make this recommendation, through their agreement. I know that the consultations took place last week. Is that it, Véronique? So we have within 30 days, we can submit recommendations and position papers, and not at the end of December, as they mentioned. So that's my point of view. Thank you. I'll allow Pascal to speak if she has something to add, because she's the one who worked on this file. Yeah. I don't think I haven't slept the last 3 days, so I could fix this. So I could set this up. Many of us weren't sleeping a few weeks ago because it's ridiculous, these time frames. And yeah, it's a good opportunity. Even if it's an imperfect process, then we've denounced it. It's a good opportunity to voice these concerns. And yes, we've noted it on our end, and Ms. Andre, and we don't have. We find that yes, the time frames are really too tight and too short, and so we will be mentioning this, of course. I think it shows once again the constraints. As natives and non-natives, we encountered the same thing. People were just thrown into this process, but sometimes it's difficult to work in this kind of a pre-established framework. Thanks, everyone. I'll take a few seconds just to explain this photo. It's important. The camp of a good friend of mine, George Kudlu, who is an Inuit he lives in Wiminji on Cree territory on the east coast of James Bay. I had spent some time there a few years ago. Jurisdictional framework for protected areas in Quebec governance and management. That's where I'll be addressing the different statuses which exist and are available in Quebec. As I said before, there are 32 legislative tools or protected designations that exist in Quebec. 2 Quebec ministries as well as 2 federal ministries or agencies are responsible for them. I see a bit of a glitch on my French copy, but under 2 federal ministries or agencies. The ministère de l'Environnement et de la lutte contre les changements climatiques, Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, Ministry of Forests, of Wildlife and Parks, and federal departments and government agencies. A note here concerning Bill 46, which concerns laws for the law, the LCPN, the Proposed Aquatic Reserve. It's under the responsibility of the Quebec Environment Ministry. So this affects all these statuses that I present here on the screen, which are tools for the MELCC. Those that are in italics will be removed. The first for a threatened or vulnerable species, threatened or vulnerable plant species habitat. So this one is not being changed or affected. So you notice that all of the projected statuses will disappear. The proposed reserves will disappear, seeing as these were dependent on the holding of a BAP hearing, well, these will be withdrawn. There is also the status of proposed aquatic reserve withdrawn. It will be matched with biodiversity reserve. So this status, I see a very similar role. So for a biodiversity reserve, it's about the same as aquatic reserve, and there will be a new status in the bill. There's one, which is one for a status of a marine reserve. Because right now they don't have a specific status for maritime areas. But there was an aquatic reserve, but this will be a maritime reserve. This will mention this next weekend. There's also a proposal. There's a status that's under study for protected areas for sustainable development. So it goes under category 6 that we presented before. And as I mentioned, in these questions, there is no protected area. It is due to generic labels or names that were placed on these during the consultation. So for the Ministry of Environment, there is threatened or vulnerable plant species that are under the Ministry of the Environment, and parks and forests and are under the authority of a different ministry. And we have these statuses. There are 3: biodiversity, ecological, and private land. A recognized natural reserve. This is on private land. Status is used when a private landowner wants their property be recognized. So they'll set up objectives and conservation measures for this to be recognized. So this will be a way to recognize this sort of initiative. And I'll come back to this. I'll talk about specific activity regimes that are specific to the 3 main statuses. We talked about for the area, the biodiversity reserves are the largest or the most major ones. The threatened or vulnerable plant species habitats are often very small protected areas. Wood garlic, let's say, which is a threatened species. An ecological reserve are very strictly defined reserves or areas, and also recognize this. It's going to be a man-made landscape and proposed man-made landscape. There are none that have been submitted. So this will show you the tools that are under the responsibility of the Ministry of Environment. I mentioned this, but when a protected area is set up, we use this in the Western approach. We like to divide and compartmentalize nature. One could use different names, but sometimes they don't use the same terminology, but the ministries should align their efforts to make sure that they are all on the same page with this. And now the FFP, these will not be affected by the review of the Conservation and Protection Act. So these shouldn't be changing. We have exceptional forest ecosystems. There are 3 types of EFEs. So 3 kinds of exceptional forestry ecosystem, 8 kinds of wildlife habitats for different species that we want to animal species we wish to protect. Quebec National Parks under the Parks Act, and there's also Quebec National Park Reserve. This is a temporary status that we grant to a territory before all the consultation processes are completed. Sometimes we mix these up. So in the province of Canada, it's a provincial park, and there we have provincial parks, and we also have federal parks like Parc de la Mauricie, Forillon National Park, Mauricie National Park. These are under the responsibility of Parks Canada. It's federal, but most of our national parks, those are provincial parks like Mont-Tremblant. I'm in Montreal, so Saint-Bruno, Boucherville, L'Île de Boucherville, Jacques-Cartier. These are all from Quebec Park. Then we have a biological sanctuary, and these are different protected areas that allowed us to have access to forest areas. And then we have wildlife sanctuaries here. These are small protected areas which are targeted to protect specific wildlife species. Most of this, I won't talk about this a lot. I was talking about national parks with the biodiversity parks. I think it's the second or the main one for the area for the protected areas of Quebec. The other ones, there are many small wildlife habitats. They vary in size, but many are quite small. See, is we're targeting one species or one ecosystem. The permitted or prohibited activities will determine the process we can take. We talk about the people on the precedent page. There is a plant that we want to protect with the gathering of this plant or the destruction of its habitat will be forbidden. But the other their criteria might not necessarily be there. So the activity plan will depend on what is the specific objective. What do we want to protect specifically in these protected areas? And as I said, there are certain protected areas that are under a federal jurisdiction. There's one that's very particular. This is the National Capital Commission Park. That's the Parc de la Gatineau. Gatineau Park. And then there's the Canada National Park and National Park Reserve. I mentioned this, Parks Canada. We have migratory bird sanctuaries, and we have national wildlife reserves. And there's some that are in the St. Lawrence along the shores that will protect a certain, that are in some cities, and there's some small areas and migratory bird sanctuary. They protect the migratory corridor, the nesting sites. We target more specific sites, and we have activity plans to see what is permitted or forbidden. It will depend on the targeted species and its specific characteristics, and the characteristics of the protected area as well. So there are other statuses as well. There's the marine part in the Saguenay. There's an ad hoc act that was adopted for the MFFP and Parks Canada. It's joint responsibility between the province and the feds, but this is a specific and unique case. I can talk about this more next week. There's the natural voluntary conservation environment, private sites. They're not recognized as natural reserves. And the last one, I'll talk about this a bit. It is the land reserve for a protected area. It is administrative protection. So it's not embedded into a law, but it is, these are guidelines for land reserve for a protected area. So one ministry will set, it will depend which ministry finds it under its jurisdiction. We have land protected, and through administrative measures from industrial activities, forestry, mining, and energy production, which is until moving on to another stage, and for it to have the status of a protected area. There's George River. There are some in northern Quebec. And I said we'll come back next week because the Quebec government is setting up a marine area, a temporary step for a protected area. So it's not really a protected area status. It's kind of it's a sort of a step towards another category that allowed us to have temporary protection while the process is underway. Now for the activity regime, ecological reserve, there are many of these, but in terms of area, you have larger areas. No one has the right to enter, which is L'Île Brio, near the Magdalen Islands. No one can even set foot on the ecological reserve. All activities that may alter ecosystems are prohibited unless otherwise authorized by the minister. That's the position in the act. It is under the natural, it's the act for a natural heritage. We have an ecosystem. We have a very specific element that we wish to protect. There can be some activity, research activities for a follow-up, but there's something that's quite strict. The Dolores mentioned what would be more interesting for the Native communities. Let's say if there is a place or you don't want anyone to go for whatever reason, it's a very fragile area. This is a place that could be interesting to understand. There will be no traditional activity will be allowed. There's a certain utility, a usefulness in a certain context. We have the biodiversity reserve as well. We think of a tool that is very interesting for the Native communities. Industrial activities are prohibited. Allows us to have this legal lever, or this going to allow us to stop leverage that will allow us to stop different and activities such as logging, mining, or hydroelectric projects, and other activities subject to approval and authorization according to the conservation objectives. And it's interesting, traditional hunting, trapping, fishing, and gathering are authorized in the biodiversity reserve. I'm trying to make a small parallel between the comments that Melissa made, the tools that we present, even if there is in the indigenous protected area, it doesn't mean that it excludes the other functions as well. In my experience, after having worked with the Cree community, namely, there are some communities who want to prevent industrial development. So they will, instead of going for a different label or just to declare this, that it's declared, they want something in the Mines Act as well in Quebec. It has a legally binding document. It has a lot of legal basis. So the biodiversity reserve will allow them to cease these industrial activities but continue other ones. But there are many biodiversity reserves, and some of your communities are working with this tool. For the national parks, as I mentioned, we have a map of the protected areas. It's the second one, which is the most widely used. Hunting and trapping are prohibited in national parks. We'll just qualify this statement. Fishing is allowed. Entry fees are required. Provisions in comprehensive land claim agreements, hunting and trapping can be allowed if there are provisions in the comprehensive land claim agreements, like in the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. There is a position that says the hunting and fishing they find that this use is consistent with the other uses as well. But in some places, a hunt is allowed. It depends on the discussions. And these terms are often laid out in land claim agreements as well. So in national parks, one of the main objectives of national parks is the valuing of the site recreotourism activities. So this kind of activities are allowed within national parks as long as it's compatible with the conservation of the territory. And man-made landscapes, as I said before, these are all landscapes that were formed by human action. I think this is a tool that can be quite interesting for certain native communities, or the use that we've made of the territory for generations has shaped the landscape, and also the regime will depend on the conservation objectives and the terms agreed upon by the native community and the ministry. So it can be the category can be quite flexible. It's often in protected areas, but this is a tool that can be used, but we don't see an example of this in Quebec, so it's hard to see how this can play out in reality. And also, the definition of man-made landscapes will also be further defined and specified. So for other information regarding traditional activities, treaty lands, ancestral rights related to hunting and trapping takes precedence over protected area legislation. In non-treaty lands, there's an obligation to consult Indigenous communities. As I said before, these rights linked to hunting and trapping can be found within certain protected areas, namely national parks. This also has to be entered, or this has to be included in a treaty. I think that's interesting. There's a possibility to put these things side by side for traditional activities. Like in the Pemmican Park, there's a possibility of juxtaposing different protected area categories to allow for traditional activities to continue. But the island was removed from Opimichan National Park for this reason and soon to be designated as a biodiversity reserve. And the communities, the park received this request, and this will be within the park. There will be a small biodiversity zone. So the park's limits will be just juxtaposed with the different category. So this way, the native community can continue to practice their traditional activities. So, and you work having a park. It's interesting if you want to value the territory and also allow people to have different uses of it as well. It's possible. We're talking about an ecological reserve, which is a very strict status. We can say, the communities say that this place is like a sanctuary and we don't want people to go there. We can put an ecological reserve there with a biodiversity area as well, which will allow us to continue these activities. So there is a flexibility that exists by using several of these tools that are available. So we have the ministries to agree that there is an intergovernmental consensus. So that means two ministries or two departments, two ministry and a department will you work together to manage these protected areas. But this could be quite interesting. Regarding management for the national parks, south of the 50th CPAC harmonization table, it's linked to the Parks Act, which is the organization which is in charge of managing national parks in Quebec. When there is a national park which is set up, there is a harmonization table which is created where a indigenous community can sit with other factors. This table has an advisory role to provide opportunities for local actors, including First Nations, to discuss park management. I talked to somebody from Parks Quebec yesterday, and there's no precedent south of the 50th parallel of national parks that are managed by a band council or Indigenous community. However, in the last years, there was the will in the two parks, the most recent park, which were created, Temiscouata Park. There was consultation which was done with surrounding Native communities. There's often the possibility to have a committee as well, parity committee, which was set up in Opemican Park. I don't have the details on this, unfortunately, a joint committee. So some communities were not involved in the creation of these parks, but for 3 years there was a will to involve the communities more and allow them to sit on these councils, on joint committees. And this is done in the Parc de la Jean Cartier, Mount Alford, and Mont Mégantic as well, Mégantic Mountain. The minister can also delegate through a contract. First, band council, the power to operate a business, provide a service, or organize an activity linked to park operations inside or outside the park boundaries. These are communities that are governed by that are not under a band. Sometimes they are not band councils, like national parks in Nunavik are managed by Nunavik Parks. This is Nunavik Parks is under Kativik regional government. So this is a possibility of delegating for park management activities. The discussions that I had before with people from Parks Quebec, it's interesting for a community to be able to manage a park that all of the national parks south of the 50th are managed. They'll have to be profitable, and sometimes it complicates the management of the park. So, but as told Parks Quebec, it won't be interesting to see band council to be a manager of a park, because there's a big administrative load as well, and you don't necessarily have the resources within the community to run the park. So this system is far from being perfect, and we look at the system as it is right for national parks. For protected areas of the Ministry of the Environment, once again, there's a possibility to delegate in parts or entirely the management of a protected area under its authority. Specific provisions depend on negotiated agreement, and there are new measures to clarify this will be included in Bill 46. It's be called to change, but there is a possibility for new measures will be clarified as well for biodiversity. This approach was used in some of your projects as well. So I'll repeat what I said at the beginning. So for the time being, this is quite limited. I would say that in certain cases, it's a majority by the government, even in co-management, that we don't have this for the time being. The reason why this happens is that a lot of protected areas have a temporary status, and the final management plan wasn't set up to see how these protected areas will be managed. There are tools as well that are available. The targets. There were also the agreements that were made. So these are. I lost that last part. I didn't hear it. So now I'd like to know if you have any questions.
Oui, on a une question ici, François
I have a
Fortin.
question here. François Fortin, SCPIT. Oh, I can hardly hear him. It's like he's underwater. Sorry, I can't translate this. So it's for the management of the park. But the creation of parks, but in the creation process, there are working committees that are created. The community can get it, but this is a possibility, of course. There aren't any that exist, but there's the possibility there. And from my understand, the specific role that this joint committee would play will be determined according to what's negotiated between the community and Parks Quebec or the CEPAC. And there is no established model for this. It depends on agreements. It depends on your interest. Sometimes it depends on the quality of the negotiation, and there are specific characteristics. This offers flexibility, but on the other side, there's no minimum that can ensure if there's a parity committee. I don't have any more specific information to provide here, but it's a possibility that's there. And from what I understand, Parks Quebec is open to this possibility. Thank you. So this would be in a co-management model. It's in co-management, where there is more power granted to the community and more to the government, or vice versa. So protected areas and First Nations. We're talking about the involvement of Indigenous peoples in the protected areas. There are few people who are aware of this background. Now I started working here. I presented this presentation to my colleagues. I think it's fundamental when you work in protected areas, because there is a historical package that when comes with the working with protected areas, and there was a lot of evolution. This has evolved quite a bit, and this has impacts on the perceptions we have and the discussions we have with people who are against protected areas, because there's a sort of vision that is erroneous according to what was done in the past. And there were people were hurt. Protected areas and Indigenous people hasn't always been a real love story. It hasn't always gone well. So the first protected area in the world was the Yellowstone National Park. It was set up in around the 1850s. But it's a bit strange that the person who imagined this park wanted to protect the Indigenous people who lived within the park, their way of life. Finally, there was a bit of it changed its original mandate, and finally they changed it, and they kicked out, they evicted the native population to create a park where we allowed non-natives to come in and to take advantage of this park, but wanted to protect a virgin nature. That was the approach. Seeing as the approach, the Yellowstone model, where we have the setting up of different parks until the 1960s. In Quebec, there was Forillon, a federal national park, which was set up in the 1960s, related to the eviction of the people lived there, with native and non-native included. And it's there are still people wounds stemming back from this mass expulsion. As a park in Western Canada, where we allowed Indigenous people to come in, practice this, but they practice their activities. But it was like a glass bell approach. We wanted to protect virgin nature. We realized that this model did not really work. It led to a lot of conflicts in the 1980s and 90s. These protected areas didn't even reach their conservation goals because there was so much tension. There was poaching as well. The communities continued to use these areas, and when they hunted there, they would be treated as poachers. So in the 1980s, 1990s, new approaches were adopted. We talked about the origins of Category 6 in the Amazon region. So we realized that it would be more interesting to work with the surrounding communities and offer them, to allow them to benefit from protected areas and to have less conflict and to be able to meet the conservation objectives. And from a human approach, it's much fairer and more adequate. In the 1990s, it's 2000. This didn't always work. We are developing new models. There's a group of biologists, which there was the mitigated success and the protectionist approach regained ground. And from the 2000s to present time, we have a lot of tools and different co-management approaches, co-governance approaches, and a biocultural conservation, CAs. So this recognition, because in our glass belt approach, we're thinking of the human beings as well. But some people were paying to use the territory. But the biocultural approach, we have to realize the effect that the human being is an integral part of the ecosystem. So what I was saying is, over the last 2 decades, there are many new approaches that are much more respectful and that take into account Indigenous approaches, the interests of Indigenous communities, Indigenous protected areas. So it's since the beginning of the 2000s to the present, we talked about this. So it's in academic circles. There are a few initiatives as well, more and more. We had different examples throughout the world. There's the consortium, a pack for protected areas, ICCA consortium. We talked about living environment, a living territory. We have organizations, native organizations that reflect on certain models. We have the just circle. There's just the Cree Nation government, I believe, that took part in this, but they're representatives from different Indigenous nations in Canada who looked into the Indigenous protected area model, and they issued a document, a report that's quite interesting. So this history hasn't always been great, hasn't always been positive, but I think today there are a lot of opportunities connected to protected areas. Of course, it's far from perfect, but we'll have new tools that will be available in the upcoming months. It's something that is moving. I find that we are at a time where there's a lot of openness and a lot of opportunities. I'm very optimistic about what's coming. Yeah, it's not going to be perfect. There are many challenges and a lot of projects were put forward. Unfortunately, the government is not responding to these, but however, it's great to see these projects so we can work together and joint effort. And there are many ways that we can accomplish these projects, achieve these projects. So I'll go back to our model again. It's a model where it's governance by the government, where the government is the main actor. This might have to be changed. I think there are many different co-governance models that have to be developed. So this diagram will be changing in the upcoming years. Currently, with tools that I started talking about, the involvement of First Nations can take place in three main stages for protected area proposals. We have two examples. Mbushkwa, Matushkwa. I was very much involved in this one with the Cree community of Womenji. Unan. This has been protected since 2008. It was a project that was put forward starting from the community, the hunters' families, to protect everywhere, to provide protected areas on the territory. So this is an initiative from the community. And I know that other communities have projects as well. So that's one thing we can move forward. In the creation process, when it's it's a government project, it's participation in working committees, public consultations, targeted consultations. It's often an obligation for the government to inform and consult Indigenous nations when there's a project that could affect their territory, and management through partial or total delegation of power. There's not that many examples of this. And we have in this kind of space, but there's a big difference between the territory under the agreement, like the James Bay Agreement. These terms are entrenched in the agreements. It's more complicated for communities that are not under such a treaty. There's a harmonization tables in parks, employment in park staff, like in the Opemican Park. So there's a possibility. It's far from being perfect. Once again, we have many different factors. There are different possibilities. I think there will be a great deal of openness on the government's part to set up new models and new approaches. In the surveys that were sent out, there is a question of having impact on the territory. And it'll be different if it's a protected area project, which was put forward by a community, and the community is an instigator for regarding a project that was proposed by the government. And the goal of protected areas is to regulate and control activities on the land. So the implementation, it can limit or affect our traditional activities as determined by the status and the agreements that had been negotiated. There are also benefits. Also, we have control over forestry. There's for mining development. So it has a positive impact of providing legal protection and the long term to protect them from unwanted industrial activities. It can also provide legal protection and the long term that from other unwanted activities that can destroy nature, like the erosion of villages, just having tourism or uncontrolled adventure tourism can be cause problems, can destroy or harm sites. and there are different human activities that can disturb an area. And if we designate a place as a protected area, we can mark control the coming and going. And also we allow for the monitoring of plant and animal populations. For many of you, when you continue to go hunt and trap, you're there, you do the follow-up as well. For the setting up of a protected area, we will provide resources to be a little bit more structured, to have this more regular. So there are advantages at this level, but there's a change. The idea to set up a protected area is not to keep the status quo necessarily. In some cases, it could be so, but if there's not threatened yet, it's to keep the status quo, but the goal usually is to prevent the degradation or disappearance of a certain element or species. So this about covers it. Melissa, to do the follow-up for the questions. Thank you very much, Veronique. We're talking of the land reserves. Next week, it'll be the maritime. And then it'll be indigenous protected areas. It's a great challenge. It's very heavy because we're trying to introduce a structure which is natural, which is used by the communities. We have to deal with very restrictive structures the government really believes in, of course. So we have to undo the concept of a protected area for someone who's worked all his life in a protected area. And as a community, we have to work, we put forward our experience, and we're often said, we can't do that, we can't do this. But we saw over the last decades throughout the world where there are protected areas, it's suitable. It meets, this protected area has to meet with certain conditions to industries and the government. Like there's some really bad examples. There's Native communities who are trying to protect what is surrounding that area. I missed the name that she mentioned. And we talked about their health, their safety, and human relations. So when we talk about protected areas, conventional marine protected areas, we're able to imagine where the government is stuck. They are forced to work in this way in their project. We want to give them tools to allow the First Nations communities to work. And this is great that these are tools that can be put forward by Native communities and also in support with the work of the Crees. We see this a lot in Equanchit. They work with the MRC, members of the communities, the surrounding communities. So it's not just between Native and non-Native. It's just the way we can work towards the future together. You can see that for a long time, our voices and our rights were not listened to, our rights were not respected. So we have the capacity to do all this work, and often a small community of 600 people, and then we ask them to put forward this big project. And working with the government will allow us to put forward projects which are very interesting at a cultural level. I think of Wapashkan, but as a tool, work that comes out of Esipit to protect the calving grounds. So it depends on the community's capacity to deliver the goods. So each community has to work on this, not just on protected areas under the protection of the government. Sorry, the horrible lapse there, slip of the tongue. Protect the environment of the government and protect the environment around their community, and to have job creation as well. So by wanting to work together, by wanting to move forward and to have them understand the realities. It's one of the issues that we will try to develop here, not to force everyone to go, okay, everyone's going to have native protected areas. Here's the only model, but for these protected areas, we should be adapted to the reality of each community and also respect the time required as well. The members of the community have to be involved, and we also have to understand what's going on around us, the community. Why might do it? It might not be the same thing for us because we don't have the same realities, we don't have the same territories, etc. I'm really looking forward to the next webinars as well. Thank you very much for the entire presentation.